The sky bled crimson over Prosperity, Colorado, as Harriet Winters stood on the auction block, her wrists bound with rough hemp rope. The year was 1876, and the promise of the West had turned to dust in her mouth. She kept her gaze fixed on the distant mountains, refusing to meet the hungry eyes of the men gathered in the dusty town square. "Next up, gentlemen, a woman of questionable virtue," the auctioneer bellowed, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Found in the company of bandits. No family to speak of. Starting bid is $5. Harriet flinched at the lies. She had never ridden with bandits. Her only crime was fleeing a violent husband who had connections with the town's sheriff. When she'd been caught at the edge of town 3 days ago, they'd concocted this story to justify what they were about to do. Women who fled their husbands needed to be made examples of, the sheriff had told her with cold eyes. A chorus of jeers rose from the crowd. Someone shouted an obscene suggestion, and laughter rippled through the gathering. Harriet felt her cheeks burn, but she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. 22 years of life had taught her that tears were wasted on men like these. $5. Shouted a grizzled miner, his beard stained yellow with tobacco. "7, countered a portly shopkeeper. $10 for the lady, called a voice from the back. The auctioneer grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Now we're talking, gentlemen. Do I hear 15? The bidding continued, each dollar driving Harriet deeper into despair. This couldn't be happening, not in America, not in 1876. But the frontier had its own rules, and women without protection were at the mercy of those who made them. $50. The shout silenced the crowd. A path cleared as a tall figure strode forward. Harriet finally looked down from the mountains to see a man unlike the others. He walked with quiet confidence, his lean frame clothed in a dust-covered duster. A worn Stetson shaded piercing blue eyes in a sun-weathered face. Unlike the others, his gaze held no hunger, only determination. $50, the auctioneer repeated, delighted. "Do I hear 60? No one challenged the bid. The stranger had an air about him that discouraged competition. "Sold to the gentleman in the back," the auctioneer declared, hammering down his gavel with finality. 2 deputies pulled Harriet down from the auction block and pushed her toward her buyer. She stumbled, almost falling before strong hands steadied her. When she looked up, those blue eyes were studying her face. Without a word, he paid the auctioneer, then gently took her bound hands in his. Leaning close, he whispered words that cut through her fear like a knife through butter. "You're safe now." His voice was low, meant only for her ears, a rough timbre that somehow conveyed more kindness than she'd heard in years. Then he turned to the sheriff, who was watching the proceedings with smug satisfaction. "I'll be taking her now," the stranger said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The sheriff chuckled. "She's all yours, mister. Hope she's worth the money." The stranger's jaw tightened, but he said nothing as he guided Harriet away from the crowd. They walked in silence through the town, past the curious stares of onlookers, until they reached the livery stable at the edge of Prosperity. Only when they were inside, away from prying eyes, did he release her hands and draw a knife from his belt. Harriet instinctively stepped back, fear flashing across her face. "Easy," he said softly, "just going to cut those ropes." True to his word, he carefully sliced through her bindings, his movements precise and gentle. As the ropes fell away, Harriet rubbed her chafed wrists, uncertain what to say or do. "My name is Jackson Reed," he said, sheathing his knife. "And whatever they said about you back there, I don't believe a word of it." Harriet studied him, searching for deception. "Why would you help a stranger?" Jackson's mouth quirked in a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let's just say I've seen enough injustice to last several lifetimes. Couldn't stand by and watch another." He turned and walked to a stall where a magnificent black stallion stood waiting. "This is Midnight," he said, patting the horse's neck. "And over there," he nodded toward a chestnut mare in another stall, "that's Penny. She's yours if you want her." "Mine," Harriet's voice caught. "I don't understand." Jackson began saddling Midnight with practiced efficiency. "It's simple, Miss Winters, Harriet Winters, Miss Winters. I have no claim on you. That auction was a mockery of everything decent. I paid to get you away from those men, not to own you." He paused, looking at her directly. "You're free to go wherever you please. But if you have nowhere to go, I have a small ranch about a day's ride from here. You'd be welcome to stay until you figure out your next steps." Harriet hesitated. The offer seemed too good to be true, but the alternative was stepping back onto the streets of a town that had just tried to sell her like cattle. "Why should I trust you?" she asked plainly. Jackson nodded as if he'd expected the question. "You shouldn't, not yet. I'm a stranger who just bought you at auction, but I give you my word, for whatever that's worth, that no harm will come to you under my protection." He finished with Midnight's saddle and moved to prepare Penny. "And if it helps, I live with my sister on the ranch. You won't be alone with me." Harriet weighed her options. This man, Jackson, seemed genuine, but she'd been fooled before. When she'd married Edward Winters 3 years ago, he had seemed kind too, until the first time he'd struck her in a drunken rage, but something in Jackson's steady gaze gave her hope. And right now, hope was all she had. "I'll go with you," she decided. "But I want you to know, Mr. Reed, that I can use a rifle, and I will if I need to." To her surprise, Jackson smiled, a real smile this time, one that softened his weathered features. "I would expect nothing less, Miss Winters. And please call me Jackson." As they led the horses out of the stable and into the fading light, Harriet felt the weight of the town's stares. News traveled fast in places like Prosperity. Already she could see curtains twitching and faces peering from windows. Jackson helped her mount Penny, his hands respectful as he steadied her. Once she was settled, he swung easily onto Midnight. "We'll ride until dark, make camp, and reach the ranch by tomorrow afternoon," he explained. "Are you able to ride that long?" Harriet nodded. "I grew up on a farm in Kansas. I can ride." With that, they set off, leaving Prosperity behind. Harriet didn't look back. There was nothing there for her now except bitter memories and the threat of being returned to Edward. They rode in companionable silence as the town disappeared behind them. The road wound through stands of aspen and pine, climbing gradually into the foothills. The late afternoon sun bathed the landscape in golden light, and despite everything, Harriet felt a flicker of peace. For the first time in months, she could breathe without fear. After an hour of riding, Jackson broke the silence. "Are you hungry? We can stop for a short break if you need it." Harriet realized she hadn't eaten since the meager breakfast the jail had provided. "Yes, thank you." They stopped beside a small stream, and Jackson pulled provisions from his saddlebag: jerky, hardtack, and dried apples. He offered her the food without ceremony, then busied himself with watering the horses to give her privacy as she ate. When he returned, he sat a respectful distance away, chewing on a piece of jerky. "I don't mean to pry," he said after a while, "but it might help me understand if you told me why they were auctioning you." Harriet considered deflecting the question, but decided truth was her best ally now. "My husband," she said simply. "Edward Winters. He's a violent man with friends in high places, including Sheriff Boggs. I tried to leave him 3 days ago. The sheriff caught me at the edge of town and decided to make an example of me." Jackson's expression darkened. "Your husband allowed this?" "Encouraged it, I expect. He believes I'm his property." She looked down at her hands, rough from work and marked with fading bruises. "The sheriff told everyone I was caught with bandits to justify the auction. They needed some pretense of lawfulness, I suppose." "There was nothing lawful about what happened today," Jackson said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "And no man has the right to treat his wife or any woman that way." His vehemence surprised her. "You have unusual views for these parts, Mr. Reed." "Jackson," he reminded her gently. "And perhaps I do. I've seen too much cruelty in this world to stomach more of it." He stood, brushing dust from his trousers. "We should keep moving if we want to make a decent camp before nightfall." They continued their journey as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. The temperature dropped rapidly with the coming evening, and Harriet was grateful for the woolen shawl she had managed to keep during her brief imprisonment. As dusk settled over the land, Jackson led them off the main trail to a small clearing beside a creek. "We'll camp here," he said, dismounting. "There's good water and shelter from the wind." He worked efficiently, setting up a small camp while Harriet tended to the horses. When she returned from securing them, she found a small fire crackling and a bedroll laid out for her on one side of the fire. "I'll sleep on the other side," Jackson explained, indicating his own bedroll set a good distance away. "You'll be undisturbed." Harriet nodded, grateful for his consideration. "Thank you." They shared a simple dinner of beans heated in a small pot and more hardtack. The food was plain but filling, and Harriet realized how hungry she had been. "Tell me about your ranch," she said as they sat by the fire, the night closing in around them. Jackson poked at the embers with a stick. "It's nothing grand, about 100 acres with a small herd of cattle. The house is solid, though. My father built it before he passed. It's just me and my sister Helena there now. She's about your age, I'd guess, runs the house and helps with the books." "And what do you do besides rescuing women from auctions?" Harriet asked, a hint of wry humor in her voice. Jackson glanced up, surprised by her jest, and a small smile touched his lips. "Mostly I chase cows and fix fences. Occasionally I take hunting parties into the mountains as a guide. It's a simple life, but an honest one." "It sounds peaceful," Harriet said softly, gazing into the flames. "Most days," Jackson agreed, "though Helena would tell you I'm a bear to live with sometimes." He cleared his throat. "Speaking of Helena, she'll have clothes you can borrow. You and she look to be about the same size." Harriet suddenly became aware of her appearance. Her dress was dirty and torn, her hair a tangled mess. She must look a fright. "That's kind of her, and you, I don't know how I'll ever repay your help." "There's no debt," Jackson said firmly. "Any decent person would have done the same." "But they didn't," Harriet pointed out. "You did." Their eyes met across the fire, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of trust. Jackson was the first to look away. "We should get some rest. Dawn comes early, and we have a long ride tomorrow." Harriet nodded and retreated to her bedroll. Despite the hard ground beneath her and the chill of the mountain night, she felt safer than she had in years. As she drifted toward sleep, she heard Jackson moving quietly around the camp, checking the horses one last time. "Rest well, Miss Winters," he said softly as he returned to his side of the fire. "Harriet," she murmured, already half asleep. "Please call me Harriet." The last thing she remembered before sleep claimed her was his voice, gentle in the darkness. "Good night, Harriet." Morning came with birdsong and the smell of coffee brewing over a fresh fire. Harriet opened her eyes to find Jackson already up and moving about the camp, his movements quiet as if trying not to wake her. "Good morning," she said, sitting up and pushing hair from her face. Jackson turned, coffee pot in hand. "Morning, hope I didn't wake you. Coffee's ready if you want some." Harriet accepted the tin cup he offered, savoring the bitter warmth. "Thank you for everything." Jackson merely nodded, seemingly uncomfortable with gratitude. "We should reach the ranch by mid-afternoon if we make good time." They broke camp efficiently, and within half an hour were back on the trail. The day was clear and crisp, the mountain air invigorating after the stuffiness of the jail cell where Harriet had spent the previous days. As they rode, Harriet found herself studying Jackson when he wasn't looking. He sat his horse with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. His profile was strong, straight nose, firm jaw shadowed with stubble, eyes that seemed to take in everything. Not a handsome man in the conventional sense, perhaps, but striking in his quiet intensity. She wondered about his past. What had he seen that made him speak of injustice with such conviction? Why did a man in his prime, she guessed him to be about 30, live alone with only his sister for company? "Something on your mind?" Jackson asked, catching her gaze. Harriet flushed, embarrassed to be caught staring. "I was just wondering how you came to be in Prosperity yesterday. It seems providential that you were there." Jackson was quiet for a moment, as if considering his answer. "I was delivering a horse to a buyer there. Bad timing on my part. I try to avoid that town when I can." "Why is that?" "Let's just say Sheriff Boggs and I have a history." His tone suggested he wouldn't elaborate further. They rode in silence for a while, the trail climbing steadily through pine forest. Around midday, they crested a ridge and Jackson reined midnight to a halt. "There," he said, pointing to the valley below. "That's Reed Valley. Our ranch is on the far side near that stand of cottonwoods." Harriet followed his gesture and saw a picturesque valley spread before them, bisected by a winding river. The land was greener here than in Prosperity, sheltered by the surrounding mountains. She could make out scattered cattle grazing in meadows and in the distance, the outline of buildings near a grove of trees. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "It is that," Jackson agreed, a note of pride in his voice. "My father chose well when he settled here." They continued down into the valley, the trail widening into a proper road. As they drew closer to the ranch, Harriet felt her nervousness return. What would Jackson's sister think of her? Would she be welcomed or viewed with suspicion? Her concerns must have shown on her face because Jackson said, "Helena has a kind heart. She'll make you feel at home." True to his word, as they approached the ranch house, a solid two-story structure of squared logs with a wide porch, the front door opened, and a young woman hurried out. Helena Reed was tall like her brother, with the same striking blue eyes, though her hair was a lighter brown, pulled back in a practical bun. "Jackson," she called, hurrying toward them. "You're late." I was beginning to worry. She stopped short when she noticed Harriet, surprise evident on her face. Jackson dismounted and helped Harriet down from Penny before turning to his sister. "Helena, this is Harriet Winters. She'll be staying with us for a while. Harriet, my sister Helena." Helena recovered quickly from her surprise, her expression warming. "Miss Winters, welcome to Reed Ranch." She shot her brother a questioning look but didn't press for explanations in front of their guest. "You must be exhausted from the journey. Please come inside." The interior of the ranch house was modest but comfortable, with solid furniture and touches of femininity that spoke of Helena's influence: embroidered cushions, curtains at the windows, a vase of wildflowers on the dining table. "I'll show you to your room," Helena said, leading Harriet upstairs. "You can rest and freshen up. I'll bring some hot water for washing, and I'm sure I have a dress that will fit you." The bedroom was small but pleasant, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a window overlooking the valley. "This was our mother's sewing room," Helena explained. "We converted it to a guest room, though we rarely have visitors." "It's lovely," Harriet said sincerely. "I can't thank you enough for your hospitality." Helena smiled, studying Harriet with undisguised curiosity. "My brother has never brought a woman home before. You must be special." Harriet felt her cheeks warm. "It's not like that. Your brother, he helped me out of a difficult situation. He's been very kind, but there's nothing between us." Understanding dawned in Helena's eyes. "Ah, I see Jackson and his strays." At Harriet's confused look, she explained, "My brother has a habit of helping those in need: injured animals, lost children, and now, it seems, a lady in distress." Her tone was affectionate rather than critical. "Rest assured, Miss Winters, you're in good hands here." Left alone, Harriet sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by the events of the past 24 hours. Yesterday morning, she had awakened in a jail cell, facing an uncertain and terrifying fate. Now she was in a comfortable home, treated with kindness and respect. The contrast was dizzying. There was a gentle knock, and Helena returned with a pitcher of steaming water, a basin, and clean clothing draped over her arm. "I'll leave you to wash up," she said, setting down her burdens. "Come down when you're ready. I'm preparing supper, and I'm sure you must be hungry after your journey." Alone again, Harriet washed away the dust and grime of the road, grateful for the simple luxury of cleanliness. Helena's dress, a practical calico in a soft blue, fit well enough, though it was a bit long. She combed out her tangled hair, wincing at the knots, and braided it into a single plait down her back. When she descended the stairs, she found Jackson and Helena in the kitchen, their conversation stopping abruptly at her appearance. From their serious expressions, Harriet guessed Jackson had been explaining her situation. "You look much refreshed," Helena said warmly, as if there had been no interruption. "Please sit. Supper is almost ready." The meal was simple but delicious: roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh bread. Harriet hadn't realized how hungry she was until the food was before her. She ate with gratitude, listening as Helena and Jackson discussed ranch matters. "Jenkins came by while you were gone," Helena told her brother. "He says that fence on the north pasture needs fixing before winter sets in." "I'll see to it tomorrow," Jackson replied. He glanced at Harriet. Jenkins is our nearest neighbor about 5 miles east. Good man. The conversation flowed easily, with Helena doing most of the talking. She had a gift for making Harriet feel included without pressing her to contribute. By the time they finished the apple pie Helena had baked, Harriet felt almost at ease. After supper, Jackson excused himself to check on the horses, leaving the women alone. As they washed the dishes together, Helena said casually, "My brother told me what happened in Prosperity." Harriet tensed, her hands stilling in the dishwater. "I want you to know," Helena continued, "that you're welcome here for as long as you need. No one will force you to return to your husband." Harriet looked up, surprised by the fierceness in the other woman's voice. "Thank you, I don't know what I would have done if your brother hadn't been there." Helena's expression softened. "Jackson has always had a strong sense of justice. Our father taught us that." She hesitated, then added, "He's a good man, my brother, the best I know, but he carries his own burdens." "What do you mean?" Harriet asked, curious despite herself. Helena sighed, drying a plate with methodical care. "It's not my story to tell, but know that he understands more than you might think about what you've been through." Before Harriet could ask more, the back door opened and Jackson returned, bringing the cool night air with him. The moment for confidences had passed. "Everything all right out there?" Helena asked. "Fine," Jackson replied. "Penny's settling in well." He looked at Harriet. "She seems to like it here." "I can understand why," Harriet said softly. That night, in the comfortable bed in the guest room, Harriet lay awake, thinking about everything that had happened. She felt safe for the first time in years, yet anxiety nagged at her. Edward wouldn't give up easily. Once he discovered where she had gone, he would come for her, of that she was certain. And when he did, what then? She couldn't stay hidden at Reed Ranch forever. Sooner or later, she would have to face her past and decide her future. With these troubled thoughts, she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. The days that followed fell into a pleasant rhythm. Harriet, determined not to be a burden, threw herself into helping around the ranch. She assisted Helena with household tasks and even ventured out to help Jackson with some of the lighter ranch work. A week passed, then two. Harriet found herself smiling more, laughing at Helena's wry observations, and looking forward to the quiet evenings when Jackson would sometimes read aloud from one of the books in the small family library. She learned more about the Reeds as time went on. Their parents had come west in the early days before the war, seeking a fresh start. Their mother had died of fever when Helena was just 12, and their father had raised them alone until his death 5 years ago. Since then, Jackson and Helena had managed the ranch together, making a modest but comfortable living. What Helena had hinted at Jackson's burdens remained a mystery. He was unfailingly kind and respectful toward Harriet, but she sensed a reserve in him, a part of himself he kept walled off from others. One evening, about 3 weeks after her arrival, Harriet was hanging laundry in the yard when she noticed Jackson by the corral, working with a young horse. She paused to watch him. His patience with the nervous animal was remarkable. No harsh words or rough handling, just quiet persistence and gentle encouragement. Without thinking, she abandoned her task and walked over to the corral fence. "He's beautiful," she said, admiring the dappled gray colt. Jackson looked up, seemingly unsurprised by her presence. "He is still green, but he'll make a fine mount with time and patience." "You have a way with him," Harriet observed. "He trusts you." "Trust has to be earned," Jackson replied, stroking the colt's neck. "You can't demand it or force it." "Is that your philosophy with people too?" she asked, sensing they were talking about more than horses. Jackson's eyes met hers, thoughtful. "I suppose it is. Trust, respect, kindness, they're all connected. Break one and you break them all." Harriet nodded, thinking of her marriage and how Edward had systematically destroyed all three. "I used to trust too easily," she admitted. "I thought the best of people even when evidence suggested otherwise. And now I find it harder to trust, but not impossible." She offered him a small smile. Jackson returned it, his eyes warming. "That's something, at least." A comfortable silence fell between them as Jackson continued working with the colt. Harriet leaned on the fence, content to watch. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, casting a warm glow over the ranch. "Do you miss it?" Jackson asked suddenly. "Your life before," Harriet considered the question. "Parts of it. I miss my parents. They passed away before I married Edward. I miss the certainty of knowing where I belonged." She paused. "But I don't miss the fear. I don't miss walking on eggshells, never knowing what might trigger his anger." Jackson nodded, his expression grave. "No one should live that way." "What about you?" Harriet asked, turning the question back on him. "Do you ever wish for a different life, something beyond the ranch?" He was quiet for so long that Harriet thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "I used to. After the war, I thought I might head to California, start fresh. But then Pa died and Helena needed me here." He shrugged. "This land is in my blood now. I can't imagine being anywhere else." "You fought in the war?" Harriet asked, surprised. He would have been very young, last 2 years of it. "Joined up at 17, like a fool thinking there was glory to be found." His expression darkened. "Found nothing but suffering and death." Harriet sensed she had touched on one of the burdens Helena had mentioned. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Jackson shook his head as if to clear away unwelcome memories. "It was a long time ago." He gave the colt a final pat and turned toward the gate. "We should head in. Helena will be wondering where we are." They walked back to the house together, the evening settling around them like a comfortable blanket. Harriet was aware of Jackson beside her, his steady presence, the occasional brush of his arm against hers. In the weeks she had been at Reed Ranch, something had shifted between them, a gradual warming that went beyond gratitude on her part and kindness on his. At the porch steps, Jackson paused. "Harriet," he said, her name sounding different somehow in his voice. "I've been meaning to ask. Are you happy here?" The question caught her off guard. "Yes," she answered honestly. "Happier than I've been in a long time." Relief flickered across his face. "Good, because you're welcome to stay, not just until you figure things out, but longer if you wanted to." Harriet's heart quickened at his words and the hesitant way he spoke them. "Are you asking me to stay, Jackson?" "I am." His eyes held hers, serious and intent. "I know it hasn't been long and you have every reason to be cautious, but I've come to." He paused, searching for the right words. "I've come to value your presence here. Helena does too." Harriet sensed there was more he wasn't saying, but she didn't press. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'd like to stay, at least for now." The smile that broke across his face warmed her more than the summer sun. "Good," he said simply. "That's good." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then the front door opened, and Helena appeared, calling them in for supper, and the spell was broken. But something had changed, Harriet thought as she followed Jackson inside. Something important. The following day dawned bright and clear. After breakfast, Jackson announced he needed to ride into the nearest town, Silverdale, for supplies. "Would you like to come?" he asked Harriet. "It's about a 2-hour ride each way. We'd be back by supper time." Harriet hesitated. She hadn't left the ranch since her arrival, and the thought of venturing out where she might be recognized was unsettling. Yet she couldn't hide forever, and Silverdale was in the opposite direction from prosperity. "I'd like that," she decided. "Let me change into something more suitable for riding." Helena helped her prepare, lending her a sturdy riding skirt and offering practical advice. "Silverdale's a decent town," she assured Harriet. "Friendly people for the most part. The general store is run by the Thorntons' lovely couple. And Mrs. Thornton makes the best peppermint candy you've ever tasted." An hour later, Harriet and Jackson set out, riding side by side down the valley road. The day was perfect for traveling, warm sunshine tempered by a cool breeze, the mountains rising majestically around them. "Have you lived in Colorado long?" Jackson asked as they rode. "About 3 years," Harriet replied. "Since I married Edward, he came west seeking opportunity like so many others. Before that, I lived my whole life in Kansas." "Do you have other family? Besides your husband, I mean?" Harriet shook her head. "My parents died of influenza 5 years ago. I have no siblings. After they passed, I stayed with an aunt until I met Edward." She glanced at Jackson. "He seemed so kind then, so full of dreams and ambition. It wasn't until after we were married that I saw who he truly was." "Men like that," Jackson said quietly. They're skilled at hiding their true nature until they have what they want. You sound like you speak from experience, Harriet observed. Jackson's expression tightened. Not personal experience, no, but I've seen it enough to recognize the pattern. They rode in thoughtful silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats soothing. Harriet found herself studying Jackson's profile again, wondering at the complexities beneath his calm exterior. "Tell me about Helena," she said, changing the subject. "She's remarkable running a household, helping with the ranch. Has she never wanted to marry?" A shadow crossed Jackson's face. "She was engaged once, about 4 years ago. Tom Mercer, son of a rancher from the next valley, good man." He paused. "There was an accident, stampede during a storm. Tom was killed." "Oh," Harriet breathed. "I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have asked." "It's all right," Jackson assured her. "Helena's made her peace with it. She says she had her chance at that kind of happiness and now she's content with what she has." "And you?" Harriet asked, emboldened by his openness. "Have you never thought of marriage?" Jackson was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the trail ahead. "I came close once, a long time ago, after the war." He glanced at her, a hint of self-deprecation in his smile. "Turns out I wasn't what she wanted." Before Harriet could ask more, they crested a hill, and Silverdale came into view in the valley below, a small but prosperous-looking town with a church spire rising above the other buildings. "There it is," Jackson said, clearly relieved by the change of subject. "Not much to look at, but it serves its purpose." They rode into town at a leisurely pace. Silverdale was indeed small, just one main street with a handful of side streets branching off, but it had all the essentials: a general store, a blacksmith, a small hotel, a barber shop, and a saloon. Unlike Prosperity with its air of desperate lawlessness, Silverdale seemed well-ordered and peaceful. Several people called greetings to Jackson as they rode down the main street, which he returned with a nod or a wave. "Jackson Reed," called a portly man sweeping the boardwalk in front of the general store. "About time you showed your face in town," Jackson smiled as they reined in their horses. "Mr. Thornton, good to see you." "And who's this lovely lady?" Mr. Thornton asked, looking at Harriet with friendly curiosity. "Harriet Winters," Jackson said. "She's staying at the ranch for a time." "Harriet, this is George Thornton, purveyor of everything useful and half of what isn't." Mr. Thornton laughed heartily. "Don't you listen to him, Miss Winters. My Martha says everything in that store has its purpose, even if some folks are too thick-headed to see it." He gestured toward the store entrance. "Go on in. Martha will be tickled to meet you. Don't get many new faces around here." Inside the store, Harriet was immediately charmed by the orderly chaos of goods, barrels of flour and sugar, shelves stacked with canned goods, tools hanging from the walls, and glass cases displaying more delicate items. A plump, cheerful woman with gray-streaked hair greeted them from behind the counter. "Jackson Reed, and you must be Miss Winters. George spotted you riding in and sent word." Mrs. Thornton came around the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm Martha Thornton. Welcome to Silverdale." Harriet was touched by the warm welcome. "Thank you, Mrs. Thornton. You have a lovely store, isn't it just? Been here 30 years next spring." She turned to Jackson. "The usual supplies, I expect." "Yes, madam, and a few extras." He handed her a list while Mrs. Thornton bustled about filling their order, chatting amiably all the while. Harriet explored the store. It had been weeks since she'd been anywhere but Reed Ranch, and the simple pleasure of browsing through merchandise lifted her spirits. She paused at a display of ribbons and fabrics, running her fingers over a bolt of soft blue cotton. It would make a lovely dress, she thought, something practical but pretty. "See something you like." Jackson had come to stand beside her, his voice low in her ear. Harriet quickly withdrew her hand. "Just looking, it's been a while since I've been in a proper store." Jackson studied the fabric she'd been touching. "It matches your eyes," he observed. Then, to her surprise, he called, "Mrs. Thornton, we'll take 5 yards of this blue cotton as well." "Jackson, no," Harriet protested. "Consider it payment for all your help at the ranch," he said firmly. "Helena's been teaching you to sew, hasn't she? Now you'll have something to practice on." Before Harriet could argue further, Mrs. Thornton had already cut the fabric and was wrapping it in brown paper. Excellent choice, she approved. That blue will look lovely with your coloring, Miss Winters. Overwhelmed by the unexpected gift, Harriet could only murmur her thanks. Jackson seemed almost embarrassed by her gratitude, quickly turning the conversation to other matters. After completing their purchases, which Jackson arranged to have delivered to the ranch the following day, they stepped back onto the boardwalk. The sun was high overhead now, the day warming steadily. "Are you hungry?" Jackson asked. "The hotel serves a decent meal." They crossed the street to the Silver Creek Hotel, a modest two-story building with a small dining room. The proprietor, Mrs. Caldwell, greeted Jackson like an old friend and showed them to a corner table. "Not often we see you in town with a lady friend, Mr. Reed," she remarked with a twinkle in her eye. Jackson cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "Miss Winters is staying at the ranch for a time. Thought she might enjoy a change of scenery." "Of course," Mrs. Caldwell replied, not quite hiding her smile. "I'll send Sally over with some menus." When she had gone, Harriet raised an eyebrow at Jackson. "I get the impression you don't bring many women to town." "None," he admitted. "Not since Helena stopped accompanying me on supply runs." "I'm honored then," Harriet said lightly, trying to ease his discomfort. Jackson relaxed slightly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Well, Helena did say if I came home without treating you to Mrs. Caldwell's apple pie, I'd be sleeping in the barn tonight." Harriet laughed, delighted by this glimpse of the siblings' relationship. "In that case, I insist we both have apple pie." Lunch was a pleasant affair, simple but well-prepared food, friendly service, and conversation that flowed easily between them. Harriet found herself observing Jackson in this new setting, away from the ranch. He was respected here, that much was clear from the way people greeted him. But there was also a distance. He maintained a reserve that only seemed to fall away when he was with her and Helena. After they had finished their meal and were enjoying the promised apple pie, Jackson said, "There's one more stop I'd like to make before we head back, if you don't mind." "Of course not," Harriet replied. "I'm enjoying being in town." Their final stop proved to be the office of Mr. Henry Daniels, attorney at law. Jackson asked Harriet to wait in the small anteroom while he spoke privately with the lawyer. When he emerged 15 minutes later, his expression was satisfied but revealed nothing of the nature of his business. "Ready to head back?" he asked, as if the stop had been of no consequence. Harriet nodded, curiosity burning within her but knowing better than to pry. Whatever Jackson's business with the lawyer, he would share it if and when he chose to. The ride back to the ranch was quieter, both of them tired from the day's activities. As they crested the final ridge before Reed Valley, the setting sun bathed the landscape in golden light, making the ranch house glow like a welcoming beacon. "It looks like home," Harriet said softly, the words slipping out before she could consider them. Jackson glanced at her, something warm kindling in his eyes. "It could be," he said simply, "if you wanted it to be." The moment hung between them, pregnant with possibility. Then Jackson nudged midnight forward, and they continued down the trail toward the waiting ranch house, where smoke curled invitingly from the chimney and Helena would be preparing supper. As they approached, Harriet realized with a start of surprise that she did think of Reed Ranch as home now. In just a few short weeks, it had become more of a home to her than any place since her parents' farm in Kansas. The thought was both comforting and frightening. Comforting because it meant she had found a place of safety and belonging, frightening because she knew how easily such happiness could be snatched away. The days that followed their trip to Silverdale brought subtle changes. Jackson seemed more at ease in Harriet's company, less guarded in his conversations. For her part, Harriet found herself seeking out his presence, taking pleasure in the quiet moments they shared, reading on the porch in the evening, talking over morning coffee while Helena busied herself with breakfast preparations. Helena watched these developments with knowing eyes but said little, merely smiling to herself as she went about her tasks. One evening, about a week after their trip to town, Jackson found Harriet alone on the porch, watching the sunset. He sat beside her on the wooden bench, respecting the silence for a time before speaking. "I've been thinking," he said at last, "about your situation." Harriet tensed slightly. "What about it?" "Your husband," Jackson said carefully. "He's still legally your husband, and as long as that's true, he has certain rights under the law." "I'm aware," Harriet replied, her voice tight. It was a reality she had been trying not to dwell on, that in the eyes of the law, she was still Edward's property. "There might be a way," Jackson continued, "to change that. Mr. Daniels, the lawyer we visited in Silverdale, he says there are grounds for divorce in cases of cruelty. It's not easy, and it would mean facing Edward in court, but it's possible." Harriet turned to look at him, hope and fear warring within her. "Divorce is scandalous. I would be ruined in the eyes of society." "Perhaps," Jackson acknowledged, "but you would be free, legally free to make your own choices, live your own life." He hesitated, then added more softly, "maybe even build a new life in time." The implication in his words was unmistakable. Harriet's heart quickened. "Are you suggesting?" Before Jackson could answer, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted them. They both turned to see a rider approaching fast from the direction of the road. Helena, who had ridden to the Jenkins farm earlier that day to help with a sick child. Jackson stood, instantly alert. Helena was riding hard, her posture urgent. Something was wrong. He stepped off the porch to meet her as she reined in her horse, breathing hard. "Helena, what is it?" "Riders," she gasped. "Coming this way, 5, maybe 6 men." Mr. Jenkins saw them on the valley road and recognized one of them, Sheriff Boggs from Prosperity. Harriet felt the blood drain from her face. Edward had found her. Jackson's expression hardened. "How far out?" "An hour, maybe less." Mr. Jenkins rode to warn them off, told them this was private property, but they didn't turn back. Helena's worried gaze found Harriet. "I'm sorry, Harriet." "I think they've come for you." Jackson turned to Harriet, his voice calm but urgent. "Go inside, pack only what you need, be ready to leave in 10 minutes if necessary." "Leave," Harriet echoed, fear making her voice shake. "Where would I go?" "I know a place," Jackson said. "Somewhere they won't find you, but we need to be ready, just in case." He turned back to Helena. "Get inside, bolt the door. If they come, I'll handle them." Helena shook her head. "I'm staying with you, Jackson. We face this together." Brother and sister exchanged a look of understanding, years of shared hardship and loyalty passing between them in an instant. Finally, Jackson nodded. "All right. But Harriet, I'm staying too," Harriet said firmly, finding her courage. "I won't run anymore. Whatever comes, we face it together." Jackson looked as though he wanted to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. He nodded grimly. "Then we don't have much time. Helena, get Pa's shotgun. Harriet, help me secure the house." The next hour was a blur of activity as they prepared for the coming confrontation. Windows were shuttered, doors barred. Jackson checked and loaded his rifle and revolver, his movements methodical and precise. Harriet watched him, struck by the transformation. The gentle rancher was gone, replaced by a hard-eyed veteran who had clearly faced danger before. "You've done this before," she observed. Jackson glanced up from his weapons. "Not this exactly, but I've faced men with bad intentions in the war and after." "After?" Harriet prompted. Jackson hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "I was a deputy marshal for 2 years after the war. Hunting outlaws in Kansas and Oklahoma Territory." This revelation surprised Harriet. "You never mentioned that." "It's not a time I'm proud of," Jackson said grimly. "I was angry after the war, looking for a fight, thought enforcing the law would give me purpose." He shook his head. "All it gave me was more violence, more death. When Pa got sick, I came home and never looked back." Before Harriet could respond, Helena called from the front window. "They're coming." Jackson moved to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters. 6 men, he confirmed. "Boggs in front," and he glanced at Harriet, "a man who matches your description of Edward." Harriet's stomach clenched, but she forced herself to look. There, riding beside Sheriff Boggs, was Edward Winters, tall and broad-shouldered, his blonde hair gleaming in the setting sun. Even at a distance, she could see the rigid set of his shoulders, the determined angle of his jaw. He had come to reclaim what he considered his property. "Stay back from the windows," Jackson instructed. "Let me do the talking." The riders approached the house at a walk, spreading out slightly as they neared. When they were about 50 yards away, Jackson stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually but visibly in his hands. Helena and Harriet remained inside, Helena with the shotgun at the ready. "That's far enough," Jackson called when the riders were about 30 yards out. Sheriff Boggs raised a hand and the group halted. "Jackson Reed," he called back, his voice carrying easily in the still evening air. "Been a while." "Not long enough, Boggs," Jackson replied evenly. "This is private property. State your business and be on your way." "My business is standing right next to you," Edward spoke up, his voice sending a chill down Harriet's spine even through the partially open door. "My wife. I've come to take her home." "There's no one here by that description," Jackson said coolly. "Just my sister and our guest, who's under my protection." Edward's face darkened with anger. "That guest is my wife, and you have no right to keep her from me." "The lady makes her own choices," Jackson replied. "And she's chosen not to go with you." Sheriff Boggs shifted in his saddle. "Now look here, Reed, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. That woman is legally married to Mr. Winters here. The law says she belongs with her husband." "The law also says a man can't beat his wife half to death," Jackson countered, his voice hardening. "It says a sheriff can't auction off a woman like cattle. Seems to me you've both been playing fast and loose with the law." Edward's face contorted with rage. "How dare you?" "What lies has she been telling you, Harriet?" he shouted toward the house. "Harriet, come out here now, inside." Harriet trembled but stood her ground. Helena squeezed her arm in silent support. "She's not coming out," Jackson said flatly. "Now I'm asking you one more time to leave my property." Edward turned to Boggs. "Sheriff, do your duty. This man is harboring my wife against her will." Boggs hesitated, glancing at the rifle in Jackson's hands. "Reed's got a reputation," he said quietly to Edward. "Was a deputy marshal after the war. They say he's fast with that rifle." "I don't care if he was Wild Bill Hickok himself," Edward snarled. "That's my wife in there, and I'm not leaving without her." The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. Jackson stood impassive on the porch, rifle ready but not yet aimed. The 6 men on horseback shifted restlessly, hands hovering near their weapons. It was Helena who broke the impasse. She stepped onto the porch beside her brother, shotgun cradled in her arms. "Gentlemen," she called, her voice surprisingly steady, "it's getting late and you've had a long ride. Why don't you make camp by the creek tonight? In the morning, we can all discuss this matter civilly over breakfast." Her unexpected offer of hospitality seemed to confuse the men. They exchanged glances, uncertain how to respond to such a normal, domestic suggestion in the midst of their confrontation. Sheriff Boggs cleared his throat. "That's very hospitable of you, Miss Reed, but we're here on official business." "And it will keep until morning," Helena replied firmly. "No one makes good decisions when they're tired and hungry. We have plenty of space by the creek, and you're welcome to whatever supplies you need for the night." Harriet, watching from inside, marveled at Helena's strategy. She was diffusing the situation without backing down, buying them time to think. After a moment's hesitation, Sheriff Boggs nodded. "All right, Miss Reed, we'll take you up on that offer, but come morning we'll settle this matter once and for all." Edward looked like he wanted to object, but Boggs silenced him with a look. The sheriff might be corrupt, but he wasn't eager for a gunfight with a former lawman. "Creek's about a quarter-mile that way," Jackson said, pointing. "Help yourselves to water and firewood, but stay clear of the house." The men turned their horses and rode in the direction Jackson had indicated. Only Edward remained, staring at the house with burning eyes. "This isn't over," he called before finally turning to follow the others. Once they were out of earshot, Jackson turned to his sister. "Quick thinking," he said quietly. Helena offered a tight smile. "Bought us some time at least. Now we need to decide what to do." They went back inside, where Harriet stood waiting, her face pale but determined. "Thank you," she said to both of them. "But I won't have you risking yourselves for me. In the morning I should don't even think about it." Jackson cut her off. "You're not going back to him, not now, not ever." "But what can we do?" Harriet asked desperately. "They have the law on their side." "Not necessarily," Helena said thoughtfully. "Jackson, what about those papers Mr. Daniels was preparing? The divorce petition?" Jackson nodded slowly. They're not filed yet, but having them might help, and there's something else. He looked directly at Harriet. Something I haven't told you. He crossed to the desk in the corner of the sitting room and unlocked a drawer, withdrawing a folded document. When I visited Mr. Daniels last week, it wasn't just about the divorce petition. I had him draw up these papers as well. He handed the document to Harriet. She unfolded it, her eyes widening as she read. This is a deed for part of Reed Ranch. 10 acres on the east side with water rights, Jackson confirmed. In your name. Harriet looked up, bewildered. I don't understand. Property ownership changes things, Jackson explained. As a landowner in your own right, you have legal standing that a dependent wife doesn't. Edward would have a much harder time forcing you to return if you own property here. Harriet stared at the deed, overwhelmed by the implications. You gave me land. Why? Jackson's eyes held her steadily. Because I want you to stay, Harriet, not just for now, but for good. The room seemed to still, the air heavy with unspoken feelings. Helena quietly excused herself, murmuring something about checking the back door, leaving them alone. Jackson, Harriet began, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything now, he assured her, but I wanted you to know you have options, real options. He took a deep breath. I care for you, Harriet, more than I expected to. More than I've cared for anyone in a long time, and if there's any chance you might feel the same way. Harriet moved toward him, the deed still clutched in her hand. I do, she said simply. I care for you too. These past weeks they've shown me what life could be like. What happiness could feel like. Jackson's expression softened, hope lighting his eyes. Then we'll find a way through this, together. They stood close now, the air between them charged with possibility. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Jackson raised a hand to her cheek. His touch was gentle, reverent, so unlike Edward's rough handling that Harriet felt tears spring to her eyes. You deserve happiness, Harriet, Jackson said softly. And if you'll let me, I want to spend my life trying to give it to you. In answer, Harriet leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, then deepening as Jackson's arms came around her, drawing her close. In that moment, with the threat of the morning hanging over them, they found a perfect clarity. Whatever came, they would face it together. When they finally pulled apart, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. We should make plans for tomorrow, he said reluctantly. Harriet nodded, though she was loath to break the spell of the moment. What do you think they'll do? Boggs will try to use his authority as sheriff, Jackson reasoned. But he's outside his jurisdiction here. Our county sheriff is Ben Miller, good man, fair-minded, if we could get word to him. Jenkins, Helena said from the doorway, rejoining the conversation. We could send word to Jenkins to ride for Sheriff Miller at first light. Jackson nodded. Good idea, and in the meantime we stall. Keep them talking as long as possible. They spent the next hour laying plans, preparing for every contingency. When they finally retired for the night, it was with the understanding that none of them would sleep deeply. The threat was too near, the stakes too high. In her room, Harriet sat on the edge of the bed, the deed to her 10 acres of Reed Ranch land still in her hand. She thought of Jackson's words, his kiss, the promise of a future together. Then she thought of Edward, waiting by the creek, determined to reclaim her. She had run once before and been caught. This time she would stand her ground. Dawn broke clear and cold over Reed Valley. Harriet, who had slept fitfully, dressed with care in one of Helena's sturdier dresses. She braided her hair tightly and pinned it up, a small act of defiance against Edward, who had always insisted she wear it loose. Downstairs, she found Jackson and Helena already up, coffee brewing on the stove. They had agreed that Helena would prepare breakfast as promised, a show of normalcy and hospitality that might keep the situation calm. Jenkins rode out an hour ago, Jackson informed Harriet quietly. With luck, Sheriff Miller will be here by midday. And if he isn't? Harriet asked. Jackson's expression was grim. Then we improvise. They heard the riders approaching just as the sun cleared the eastern mountains. Helena poured coffee into mugs with steady hands, while Jackson checked his revolver one last time before tucking it into his belt, concealed by his jacket. Ready. He asked Harriet. She nodded, squaring her shoulders. Ready. Together they stepped onto the porch to face the day and whatever it would bring. The 6 men rode up to the house, stopping at a respectful distance. Sheriff Boggs and Edward were in the lead, both looking rested and determined. "Morning," Jackson called, his tone deliberately casual. "Helena's got coffee brewing and breakfast cooking. You're welcome to join us." Sheriff Boggs nodded. "Obliged for the offer, Reed, but first let's settle our business." Edward's eyes had found Harriet, standing slightly behind Jackson. His gaze raked over her, possessive and cold. "Harriet," he said, his voice deceptively gentle, "it's time to come home, dear. I've been worried sick about you." Harriet stepped forward, placing herself beside Jackson rather than behind him. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Edward." "This is my home now." Edward's face darkened. "Don't be ridiculous. Your home is with me, your husband." "Not anymore," Harriet replied firmly. "I'm filing for divorce on grounds of cruelty." A ripple of surprise went through the men behind Edward. Divorce was scandalous, especially when initiated by the wife. Even Sheriff Boggs looked taken aback. Edward recovered quickly, forcing a laugh. "Cruelty? What nonsense is this? I've been nothing but a good provider and husband." "The bruises tell a different story," Helena spoke up from the doorway. "As do the scars." Edward's face contorted with rage. "You shut your mouth, woman. This is between me and my wife." "Actually," Jackson interjected calmly, "it's not. Harriet is a landowner in this valley now. She owns 10 acres of Reed Ranch deeded in her name. That makes her business our business." This revelation seemed to genuinely shock Edward. He turned to Sheriff Boggs. "Is that legal? Can a married woman own property independent of her husband?" Boggs shifted uncomfortably. "It's complicated. Especially with her filing for divorce. Might need a judge to sort it out." "There's nothing to sort out," Edward snapped. "She's my wife and she's coming with me now." He nudged his horse forward as if to ride right up to the porch and seize Harriet. Jackson's hand moved to his concealed revolver, but before he could draw, another voice rang out. "That's far enough, Winters." All heads turned to see a group of riders approaching from the east, 5 men, led by a tall figure wearing a sheriff's star. Jenkins had succeeded in his mission. Sheriff Ben Miller had arrived, and with him, several deputies. "Sheriff Miller," Jackson called, relief evident in his voice, "glad you could join us." Miller dismounted and approached the porch, nodding to Jackson and the women before turning to face Boggs and Edward. "Sheriff Boggs, you're a long way from prosperity. What brings you to my county?" Boggs straightened in his saddle. "Official business, Miller. This man's wife ran off and we tracked her here, just trying to reunite a family." Miller's weathered face remained impassive. "I see. And does this official business include the auction I've been hearing about? The one where this lady was sold to the highest bidder?" Boggs paled slightly. "That's not. It wasn't like that." "Wasn't it?" Miller turned to Harriet. "Madam, I'd like to hear your version of events, if you don't mind." With steady voice, Harriet recounted everything: her marriage to Edward, the abuse she had endured, her attempt to flee, the illegal auction, and Jackson's intervention. As she spoke, Miller's expression grew increasingly grim. When she finished, Miller turned back to Boggs. "Sounds like you've overstepped, Boggs, way overstepped. Human trafficking is a serious offense, even in frontier territories." "Now, wait just a minute," Boggs protested. "It was just a bit of frontier justice. It was a crime," Miller cut him off. "And I'm inclined to believe the lady's account over yours." He turned to Edward. "As for you, Mr. Winters, your wife has made serious allegations against you, filed for divorce, and established residency in this county. You have no right to force her to return with you." Edward's face was a mask of fury. "This is outrageous. She's my wife." "She's a person," Miller replied evenly, "with rights of her own. Now, I suggest you and Sheriff Boggs return to prosperity. Any further attempts to remove Mrs. Winters against her would constitute kidnapping, and I will arrest you." For a moment, it seemed Edward might defy the sheriff. His hand twitched toward his gun, and Jackson tensed, ready to draw. But Boggs, seeing the deputies with Miller, placed a restraining hand on Edward's arm. "Let it go, Winters," he muttered. "We're outnumbered here." Edward shrugged off Boggs's hand, his eyes never leaving Harriet. "This isn't over," he hissed. No court will grant a divorce without proof. It'll be your word against mine, and who do you think they'll believe? A respectable businessman or a woman who ran off with another man. They'll believe the truth, Jackson said quietly, which is all we need. Edward glared at him with naked hatred. You think you've won, Reed? You think you can just take my wife and get away with it? I'll see you both ruined before this is over. Enough, Sheriff Miller stepped between them. Mr. Winters, you're leaving now, either of your own accord or in custody, your choice. For a tense moment, Edward hesitated. Then, with a final venomous look at Harriet, he wheeled his horse around. Let's go, he snapped to Boggs and the others. The group rode away, Edward's rigid back radiating fury. Sheriff Miller watched until they were well down the valley road before turning back to Jackson and Harriet. They'll be back, he warned. Men like Winters don't give up easily. We'll be ready, Jackson assured him. And thank you, Sheriff. Your timing was perfect, Miller nodded. Jenkins explained the situation, couldn't let a fellow lawman face that crew alone. He glanced at Harriet. Madam, if you're serious about that divorce, I'd suggest you speak with Judge Wilson in Silverdale as soon as possible. He's a fair man, and he's seen enough cases of abuse to understand the situation. I will, Harriet promised. First thing tomorrow. Miller and his deputies stayed for the breakfast Helena had prepared, the mood gradually lightening as the immediate threat receded. When they finally rode out, Miller promised to have deputies patrol the valley road for the next few days, just to be safe. Once they were alone again, Harriet felt the tension drain from her body, leaving her exhausted but relieved. It's not over, she said softly to Jackson as they stood on the porch, watching Miller's party disappear down the road. No, Jackson agreed, taking her hand in his. But we've won the first battle, and we'll win the rest too. He squeezed her hand gently. Together. The weeks that followed were a mixture of anxiety and hope. Harriet, accompanied by Jackson and Helena, made multiple trips to Silverdale to meet with Judge Wilson and file the necessary papers for her divorce. The judge, a stern but fair-minded man in his 60s, listened to her story with growing indignation. Cases like yours are why divorce laws exist, Mrs. Winters, he told her after hearing her account. The law is not meant to trap women in dangerous marriages. Edward, as expected, contested the divorce, claiming Harriet had abandoned him and engaged in immoral behavior, a thinly veiled reference to her living at Reed Ranch. But Judge Wilson was not easily swayed by such accusations, especially when several witnesses from Prosperity came forward to testify about Edward's violent temper and the illegal auction. Through it all, Jackson remained steadfast at Harriet's side, his quiet support never wavering. Their feelings for each other deepened with each passing day, though both knew they must wait for the divorce to be finalized before they could openly acknowledge what was growing between them. Helena, for her part, embraced Harriet as the sister she had never had, teaching her the intricacies of running the ranch house and supporting her through the difficult legal proceedings. The three of them fell into a comfortable rhythm, working together to maintain the ranch and prepare for whatever challenges lay ahead. Edward made one more attempt to reclaim Harriet, showing up at the ranch alone one evening when Jackson was checking the cattle in the north pasture. But Helena was ready with her father's shotgun, and Harriet stood her ground, refusing to even speak to him through the closed door. He left when one of Sheriff Miller's deputies rode up, having spotted him on patrol. After that incident, Edward seemed to accept that force would not work. Instead, he turned to slander, spreading vicious rumors about Harriet in Prosperity and even in Silverdale. But the communities, having seen the couple together and witnessed Jackson's respectful treatment of Harriet, largely dismissed these attempts to damage her reputation. Finally, after 3 months of legal battles, Judge Wilson granted the divorce. The evidence of cruelty is substantial, he declared from the bench, and no woman should have to endure such treatment regardless of marriage vows. It was a landmark decision for the territory, one that recognized a woman's right to leave an abusive marriage. As they left the courthouse that day, Harriet felt as though a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She was free, truly free for the first time in years. Jackson took her hand as they walked to their horses. "How does it feel?" he asked quietly. Harriet considered the question. "Strange," she admitted. "Wonderful and terrifying all at once, to be responsible for myself again, to make my own choices." She looked up at him. "It's overwhelming." "You don't have to face it alone," Jackson reminded her, his voice gentle. "Unless you want to." Harriet stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "I don't want to be alone," she said with quiet certainty. "I want to be with you, Jackson, if you'll have me." Jackson's face softened, his eyes warming with an emotion that made Harriet's heart skip. "I've been waiting to hear those words," he said, lifting a hand to touch her cheek. "Waiting and hoping." In the middle of Silverdale's Main Street, with afternoon sun warming their faces and the future stretching before them, Jackson Reed kissed Harriet Winters, not a fleeting moment of comfort or reassurance, but a promise of all that was to come. Helena, watching from a discreet distance, smiled to herself. Her brother had found his happiness at last, and in doing so, had given a brave woman the chance to find hers as well. Epilogue: 1 year later, the October morning dawned bright and clear over Reed Ranch. Harriet stood at the bedroom window, watching the sunrise paint the valley in shades of gold and amber. Behind her, Jackson still slept, his breathing deep and even. She smiled at the sight of him, her husband of 6 months, relaxed in sleep in a way he rarely was awake. So much had changed in the year since he had whispered those words to her on the auction block in Prosperity. "You're safe now." Words that had proven prophetic in ways neither could have imagined. After her divorce was finalized, Harriet and Jackson had courted properly, though there was never any real doubt about where their relationship was headed. They were married in the spring, a simple ceremony in Silverdale's small church with Helena, the Thorntons, Sheriff Miller, and a few other friends in attendance. Edward had left Prosperity shortly after the divorce, his business and reputation in shambles after the full story of the auction became widely known. Last they heard, he had moved to California, a fact that still gave Harriet a sense of relief. The shadow he had cast over her life was finally gone. Reed Ranch was thriving under their joint management. Jackson handled the cattle and land, while Harriet had discovered a talent for breeding and training horses. Her 10 acres, originally just a legal protection, had become home to a small but growing horse business that was already earning a reputation for quality mounts. Helena still lived with them, though she had begun spending more time in Silverdale lately, particularly in the company of the new schoolteacher, a widower named James Porter. Harriet suspected there might be another wedding at Reed Ranch before too long. Life wasn't perfect, of course. The work was hard, the winters harsh, and they had their disagreements like any couple. But the foundation of respect and love they had built made even the difficult times manageable. Harriet placed a hand on her abdomen, still flat but harboring a secret she had confirmed with the doctor in Silverdale just yesterday. She hadn't told Jackson yet, waiting for the right moment to share the news that their family would be growing in the spring. As if sensing her thoughts, Jackson stirred, his eyes opening to find her by the window. "Morning," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "You're up early." "Just watching the sunrise," she replied, moving back to the bed to sit beside him. "It's beautiful today." Jackson reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that still made her heart flutter. "Not as beautiful as you," Harriet laughed softly. "Flatterer." "Honest man," he countered, sitting up to kiss her properly. When they parted, he studied her face. "You look different this morning. Happy, more than usual, I mean." Harriet smiled, not surprised he had noticed. Jackson had always been attuned to her moods, her needs, in a way Edward never had been. "I am happy, and I have something to tell you." She took his hand and placed it on her stomach, holding his gaze as understanding dawned in his eyes. "Harriet," he breathed, wonder filling his voice. "Are you sure?" She nodded, her own eyes filling with happy tears. "Dr. Parker confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby, Jackson." In the spring, the joy that spread across his face was everything she had hoped for. He gathered her in his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." They held each other as the sun rose higher, bathing their room in golden light. Outside, Reed Ranch was coming to life, horses nickering in the paddock, cattle lowing in the distant pastures, Helena's footsteps on the stairs as she began her morning routine. This was home, Harriet thought. Not just the land or the house, but the life they had built together, the family they were creating. From the depths of despair on that auction block in Prosperity, she had found her way to this moment of perfect happiness. "What are you thinking?" Jackson asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. Harriet smiled, leaning into his embrace. "I was thinking about the day we met, about how you said I was safe." Jackson nodded, his arms tightening around her. "I meant it then, and I mean it now, always." "I know," Harriet said softly. "And that's the greatest gift anyone has ever given me, not just safety, but the chance to build a life where I truly belong." As they rose to face the day together, Harriet Winters Reed carried within her not just a new life, but the certainty that some endings were really beginnings in disguise. Her journey had brought her here, to this ranch, this man, this future full of promise, and she wouldn't change a single step of the path that had led her home.